we are Environmental Enforcement Watch, part of the Environmental Data and Governance Initiative. It is me, Eric, Steve, Kelsey, and Sarah, who aren't here, and then my research assistant at University of Buffalo, Sarah Singh, who's helped put these presentations together. We could move to the next slide. So what is EDGI? And if you haven't heard of us before, we've been in action since November 2016 when Donald Trump was elected, and we anticipated a lot of scrubbing of environmental issues from federal websites, which is what we found, especially in material about climate change. And so it was, we were a lot of academics and also activists, community members, and technologists that came together to do this. And we've really emerged as a collaborative that is focusing on the environmental right to know, and in order to intervene in environmental and technological, especially environmental policy, and that about technological infrastructures in governance. And we've done a lot. So we sounded the alarm when Trump administration removed the climate change pages. Environmental Enforcement Watch, especially found significant declines in EPA's enforcement Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act and other federal environmental laws under Trump. And I'd like to add a chronic lack of enforcement even before Trump. And then we also co-created a searchable public repository of EPA disclosures through FOIA and convinced EPA not to sunset its public web archive. And then something that I've been really part of is the environmental data justice work. And it is more taking a step back and thinking about the theory behind this all, and then how to put that into practice. So really looking towards the principles of equity and decision making, making sure that people are represented equitably, and investigating cumulative impacts, socioeconomic determinants of health, even though our current regulatory systems are not centered around those, and also emphasizing the right to know, along with information access. And accessibility does not necessarily mean availability, right? So then fusing these environmental concerns with data justice and concerns over surveillance and privacy, which might, form a tension between the open data information access portion and not wanting to be surveilled and wanting to keep private. We also have looked at and uncovered data bias and harms in how people are represented by data. And then ew, I always laugh a little bit when I say ew every time. So we're a collaborative project of EDGI, bringing people together to analyze and engage with environmental data, especially the EPA's Enforcement and Compliance History Online database, which is where we all started with noticing the problems in the data and then wanting to make it more accessible, but also contextualizing that data and serving as a resource for people to explore it. All right. The challenges. As I've sort of pointed to before, we have, well, first we have the Clean Air Act language asking, what are the dangers to the public health and welfare from air toxicants? Today we're focusing on air, but this could be expanded to water, soil, everything else. And as I've pointed to, issues in the data include facilities that are regulated individually yet they pollute collectively. And the tools that we have from EPA and the data really reflect this tension, and that if you go on ECHO, you can explore facilities individually, but not see how many facilities are polluting how much in your region, for instance. And then legislation as well. The data is organized according to legislation, right? So Clean Air Act, RCRA and hazardous waste, Clean Water Act, those have separate legislation, separate data sets, yet toxicants like lead, for instance, move throughout the environment, and the environment doesn't have these pristine boundaries like the legislation and data are creating. And then also facilities are required to report biophysical measures. But as I mentioned before, what about social determinants of health? How do those measures fit in or relate to social environments and infrastructure, the built environment? And there are a lot of questions that we'll talk about in there, but regulatory data also reflects this tension. All right, I'll pass it off to Eric.
Thanks, Lourdes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data that we work with in the Environmental Enforcement Watch, or EW, and then we'll move into the demo portion, where we'll explore the tool we've made for this particular workshop. So as Lourdes mentioned, we're really focused on contextualizing different sources of environmental data. A lot of focus of our work has been on the Enforcement and Compliance History Online, or ECHO, which compiles state level and federal information from a variety of sources, such as the toxic releases inventory, as well as records of enforcement and compliance actions. And there's a nice interface that the EPA has to engage with that information. You can enter your city. You can then see all the facilities registered in the area, and you can zoom in on any particular facility and learn a lot about it, or at least see a lot of information and records about it. This is a lot of information, and it's not necessarily well contextualized. The limits or the gaps, the missing data aren't necessarily recognized. And it's, again, not summarized across a whole place. It's facility by facility. So there's a lot of information, some of which is wrong, and EPA acknowledges that elsewhere. So what can we actually do with this? And we take up that question by building data analysis notebooks, data science notebooks, as sort of civic technologies for environmental data justice. And that really is intended to address the threat of losing data access by making our own copy of those data sources, routinely updating them, so that if they are, for whatever reason, taken offline during a shutdown or whatever, we have that copy. We are also accessing the full historical set of data from ECHO, as opposed to just the 3 to 5 years of data or records that you can get from their online interface or from echo.epa.gov. We're summarizing that holistically across a place rather than facility by facility, again, to get at the cumulative effects of toxicants. And we're trying to contextualize that information. So give people more of an indication of, well, you may not necessarily want to put so much faith into these numbers because we know there's a lot of data missing there. What does this all look like? Well, that looks like the notebooks, the data science notebooks, an example of which we'll demo in just a second. They include beginner instructions. They have commented code and context there to describe what's happening, what the limitations are all along the way. Kind of like a story map, if you've ever done one of those. And we're bringing together lots of different data sources, in fact, not just ECHO. So we provide a fuller context to what we're looking at. So this is a something called a Jupyter Notebook. This is a data analysis tool. It's a website that you can visit. Anyone with a Google account can log in and actually run this, but even without a Google account, you can actually just see what it does. And we do have instructions here on how to run the notebook. It's fairly straightforward. You are essentially pressing play to run a cell of code that analyzes data and returns an output for you to view. So the first, as you can see, a notebook consists of both cells of text. So this is text here that explains kind of what's going on at this stage, and cells of code, such as this one right here in black, that actually execute code that analyze the data and return an output. So to run this notebook, we're pressing play. And this particular cell brings in code from elsewhere that we've written to help us do some of the calculations later on. Now for this cumulative impacts analysis tool, we start by bringing in some information from the toxic release inventory, TRI, that tells us a little bit about the chemicals on that are listed on TRI, and also what health systems, body systems they're known to or believed, estimated to affect. So that'll become useful for us later. And I'm not running each cell right now in this demo because I've already run them just to make sure things go smoothly, but we can come back and do that later and zoom in on different places if we like. So in this cell, we actually pull up the 2022 TRI data, which is the latest reporting year, in support of looking at, okay, what are the places, specifically zip codes, that have the most different kinds of chemicals, air pollutants in particular, being released in that zip code. And so we summarize that information and chart it out here. So these are the top 20 zip codes in terms of the number of different kinds of air pollutants reported to TRI from facilities in that zip code. So you can see in some zip codes, we have upwards of over 175 different air pollutants. We summarize that also by counties in the next step. So zip codes are kind of arbitrary units of analysis. Counties may be a bit more relevant. I know we have folks from Adams County, Colorado here today, so that might be relevant to them. And indeed, that's a nationwide analysis. We might be interested in focusing in on a specific place. So in the next set of cells, we allow folks to choose, okay, I'm coming from Colorado, I'm interested in Adams County. What do things look like there? So here we get historical records from the TRI dating back to 2013 to look specifically at what's going on in Adams County. And so these are all the reports made to Adams County facilities over the past 10 years. We summarize those year by year here and chart that out so we can see just the number of different chemical or air pollutants has risen and fallen over the past 10 years. And we look at the facilities behind that. We can see here Clean Harbors, actually the most different kinds of air pollutants. Suncor, I know, is an important facility in the county. That's number 2 here in terms of number of different air pollutants, as well as a Phillips 66 refinery. So we might look at the different zip codes within the county. Okay, so we have that here, and maybe just a map. A map is a better way of looking at this information. So, I know the Clean Harbors facility is out in the eastern part of the county there, with the Suncor refinery more in the center of the county or closer to the Denver part of the county. Of course, we're interested in potential health effects from these air pollutants. So we use that information we loaded earlier to understand, well, what are the air pollutants, the chemicals that are known to affect the most body systems? So neurological, cardiovascular, developmental, whatever the body system might be. And we see that for every year here in Adams County, there's at least one air pollutant that is known to affect 6 different body systems. And if we look more closely, we see that that's lead or lead compounds or tetrachloroethylene or PCE. And we can look at which specific body systems it's estimated are known to affect. Now, of course, these are only air pollutants that we're looking at right here, and only those reported to TRI. We know there are other important ones, like the criteria air pollutants. And we can draw, and of course, we want to understand the context in which these air pollutants are being released and reported. So we can actually draw in other data sets to make a little bit more sense of that. So we can draw on the CDC's Environmental Justice Index here and look at some of their measures of health, of disease prevalence, which is what we do here in this map. We look at essentially for each census tract within the county and actually a bit beyond the county, how many of these different diseases, including diabetes, asthma, cancer, do we see especially high rates of compared to other census tracts in the US? And I'm happy to go through a bit more about what these colors mean as we get into it. Essentially, the darker shade of color here, the more number of different diseases that census tract has an especially high rate of prevalence of. Like I said, we might want to look at particulate matter here. We can do that by drawing on EJ's screen, which includes a variety of different social, environmental, and public health measures. Here in particular, we look at particulate matter 2.5 levels and the percentile for each census tract. So comparing it to other census tracts in the country, we can see that many of those in the Adams County area are, we look at the legend here, have exceptionally higher levels of particulate matter than other census tracts throughout the country. And finally, looking at CEQ's CGIS tool to look a little bit more closely at other measures, including here, we look at particulate matter from diesel exhaust, and again, looking at how each census tract compares to others in the US. Now, it's really important to us at EDGI and EU to not just sort of look at these sort of outcomes, but to really understand what might be driving them. So we also try to explore or name, who's responsible for some of those releases that we looked at earlier. So we look again here at those 3 different pollutants that we saw were some of the most toxic, you could say, lead compounds, and PCE. And we look at the facilities over the years that have reported releasing them. So, if we look at Queen Harbor's, both lead and lead compounds, Suncor, both lead compounds and PCE. And that pattern tends to hold true if we look at this over the past 10 years, with some exceptions here and there. But of course, facility names don't really tell us about who might own those facilities. We do actually have information about corporate owners within TRI. It's not complete by any means, but facilities do report parent owner information. And so we can summarize that as well. So we see here that for all facilities in Adams County reporting to TRI, Brannan Sand and Gravel owns 6 of those facilities. Land Lakes owns a couple of Purina mills, I believe. This isn't perfect. We see Quick Creek showing up here twice, but it's a first step. And finally, here we go even one step further to try to map out where those parent companies are. And there's a lot of challenges to this kind of analysis, but just looking at some of these parent companies, where they're located or headquartered, we see that really dispersed around the country. Now, I'll give you an example of what that looks like. To run this cell of code, which includes a number of different extra sets of code that we bring in to help us out, we'd simply press play here. And it will execute that, getting us ready to do the rest of the analysis. And we are going to move step by step through this notebook in order to see the results, looking at the relationship between schools and hazardous air pollutants. Now, I've already run, for the purposes of this demo, each cell of code in this notebook, so you won't see me pressing play very often. But that is essentially how you, on your own, would run this for your own selected county and own selected school. So we start very locally. Okay, we ask you to pick a place that you want to focus on and to look more closely at the relationship between public schools and polluting facilities. So here we have a drop-down menu. We're going to look at Colorado. I know we have folks from Adams County engaging with us here today. So we're going to start with Colorado. We would run this next cell here that would give us a list of all the counties in Colorado. We're going to pick Adams County. Now next, we're going to pull in all of the public primary schools in Adams County, Colorado. We're turning to the National Center for Education and Statistics to do that, using some of the data that they've stored with Esri here. This is essentially a number of different characteristics, demographic data, attribute data, location for basically every public school in the country. It does not include colleges, universities, and it does not include private schools. So we have this big, long chunk of code here. But again, all we would need to do would be to run it by pressing play. And the result we get shows us the boundaries of Adams County, as well as these smaller orange circles, which are each of those public schools. So we click on them, we get the school name, and we also zoom in to see a little bit more about them. Okay. So the next cell tells us that we are going to actually look at the polluting facilities. So here we turn to the 2022 version of the toxic releases inventory. And we are going to focus on facilities that reported hazardous air pollutants to that inventory in 2022. Now we could go back further, but for the purposes of this analysis right now, we're only looking at 2022 so that we can compare to the school's data, which is from 2022 and 2023, that school year. So we are looking at hazardous air pollutants in particular. There are about 180 hazardous air pollutants that EPA has defined, and also keeps track of what sorts of health effects they are estimated or known to cause. So here we map Adams County again, and this time we are mapping for the orange circles different hazardous air pollutant releasing facilities. Okay, so we have the Phillips 66 terminal, the Suncor refinery, Veolia up here, a waste management company, so on and so forth. Now, we could visually go back and forth between those two maps to assess which schools are near which facilities, but we can also do that more programmatically, looking at all the schools within 1 mile of a hazardous air polluting facility. We could choose a different boundary, 5 miles, 3 miles, whatever it might be, but conservatively, we'll look at what's within 1 mile. And that's what we do here in this next cell. And because there might be polluting facilities beyond Adams County that might still be within 1 mile of a public school in Adams County, we actually bring those in as well. So if you see here, the larger orange circles are facilities that are within 1 mile of Adams County. So here's a new one, this coil coater. It's not actually in Adams County, but is within 1 mile of it. And we have the smaller orange circles here that show us, well, these are the public schools that fall within that 1 mile boundary of a hazardous air polluting facility. And now we can actually start to describe a little bit about these results. So in the next series of cells, we sort of sum things up. And we do so both for Adams County or whatever county we selected, but also nationwide. So we have a point of reference. So if we were to go back up here, we would count 18 of those small circles. There are 18 public schools near those hazardous air polluting facilities, which represents about 11% of all public schools in Adams County. And that's 10 of those larger orange circles, 10 hazardous air polluting facilities. Nationwide, we have about 9,900 schools that are within 1 mile of a facility releasing hazardous air pollutants in 2022. Similar number, but that's about 10% of all schools are in that case. And about half, one in every, every other hazardous air pollutant releasing facility is going to have a public school in its 1 mile proximity. Now, of course, we would also probably want to know what are these hazardous air pollutants that we are seeing being released and circulated so closely to public schools. And that's what we do in this next set of code here. It returns a table for us that ranks in terms of weight the reported releases of hazardous air pollutants. So we see that in Adams County, toluene accounts by weight, and this is pounds, for the largest hazardous air pollutant. And we know from the EPA also that toluene has neurological, ocular, and probably some other, you have respiratory, acute and chronic effects on health. Styrene comes in second, and we could look at those health effects as well, all the way down to chromium. Chromium, I just want to set aside here for a second. There's some interesting things to observe about chromium in terms of health effects there. You won't see much here from the EPA. Part of that has to do with the fact that chromium becomes a different, it speciates, as it circulates in the air and becomes different forms of chromium that are quite toxic, some of them, that do have, that are carcinogenic. We don't see that here because facilities are only required to report chromium proper. So it's important to acknowledge that it's being released, but we don't necessarily see the health consequences of it downstream in this table. Nationwide, we see styrene on top here, and we're looking at the top 15 in terms of weight. Now, weight is a potentially not very great measure of the effects of any given substance or the importance of it. So we also look at what are the most common, right? Because, a pound of nickel compounds is going to be different than a pound of naphthalene, for instance, let's say. So if we look at the most commonly reported, we see 3 facilities here in Adams County reporting lead compounds released. I think it's a couple, or 1 here, chromium, a couple ethylene glycol. Nationwide, 700 different facilities releasing lead compounds, manganese, over 400, so on and so forth. Now we want to know a little bit about who attends these public schools, right? So in Adams County, about 5,000 students attend schools within 1 mile of hazardous air polluting facilities. And actually 5,000 students attend those schools and qualify for free or reduced price lunch, a sort of proxy for income status and poverty as measured by the census, which is about 56% of all students. So, we look at the schools that are within 1 mile of these facilities, 56% of students qualify for free reduced price lunch, which is slightly more than qualify for free or reduced price lunch in schools outside of that 1 mile radius of hazardous air polluting facilities. Nationwide, we have over 2.5 million students qualifying for free lunch, a similar rate, in terms of 56% of students within that 1 mile buffer are qualifying. only about 50%, nationwide outside of the proximity of hazardous air pollutant facilities qualify. We also have demographic information from the National Center for Education Statistics that tells us, if we look at Adams County in particular, those schools that are near hazardous air polluting facilities tend to be quite a bit less white and quite a bit more Black or African American, Asian, and a little bit more Hispanic, Latino. Nationwide, similar set of dynamics, quite a bit less white, quite a bit more Black or African American. And then we can actually look at, so that gives us a sense of the social environment, not just the biophysical environment, that air pollutants, hazardous air pollutants are circulating near public schools, right? Where children, of course, spend a lot of time. Of course, it's not just what's going on in Adams County that you might be interested in, but any specific school. So in this final section, we can look up a specific school like Adams City Middle School and learn a little bit more about it. Now, is Adams City Middle School within 1 mile of a hazardous air polluting facility? No, but it is 1.8 miles, which is still very close, right? And indeed, there are actually 11 facilities within 5 miles. And we map that out here. So if we broaden our radius out to 5 miles, then we see a much wider scope of pollutants potentially affecting students at Adams City Middle School, which we can learn a little bit more about here. A very high percentage of students at this school qualifying for free or reduced price lunch. Also disproportionately Hispanic Latino compared to other schools in Adams County and a lot less white. So this notebook is about the state of the watershed across the US, and in particular, how well the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System is being enforced, violations of that, and what it all means for water quality. So the first thing we do here is to install some sort of helper code that the notebook will draw on throughout to make the analysis run quicker and take up fewer lines of code. So I've already done that in this demonstration previously, but to give you a sense of what that would look like to run this notebook, I've gone ahead and clicked play. It's spun around. And then you see this little check mark here that tells you it's done and you're ready to move on to the next cell of code, where you'll have an option to choose which state you want to look at. Once you select that, you'll run the next code that will give you a choice of which county in that state you want to look at. So here we've selected Adams County in Colorado. Now, we are going to look at the watersheds that traverse Adams County, Colorado, and look at the facilities regulated under NPDES in that watershed. So we do that in this cell of code. And there's a couple of things to keep in mind here, some sort of technical issues. Some watersheds we aren't able to actually retrieve information for at this point. Part of that just has to do with differences between EPA's systems and USGS's systems. It's also very hard to map all of the facilities in very big watersheds. So actually what you're seeing here is most facilities, these orange circles, but not all of them. I think there is about 1,000 or 2,000 more in this very big watershed that encompasses much of exurban Denver. And so we can kind of get a sense for what these facilities are. So, some sort of energy station. Okay, that one, not sure about. Trucking company here. And we can just take a close, here we have, some other facilities and so on and so forth. Now, we also want to know or be able to compare what's going on nationally. So we here look up all of the permits under NPDES for the entire US and what parameter or pollutant is being regulated, how frequently those have to be analyzed, and to what level the permit is at. So just as an example here, so this permit, they have to be on the lookout for pH. They have to monitor that once a week. And you can look up these codes from an external source. And that pH level has to be less than or equal to 8.5. Okay, and that is enforceable, right? So if the pH is greater than 8.5, there's a potential violation. So here we just sort of summarize what this looks like across the country. You know, what are the biggest permits for? And it's for total suspended solids. You're monitoring that twice a month or once a week. And, you know, these are some of the mean and median values. But we have 78,000 permits for total suspended solids across the country. We might want to zoom in not just on these top 10, but for any specific substance. Here we've selected lead out of hundreds upon hundreds of different regulated substances here, some of which, you know, are going to be similar to each other, but specifically total lead. And here we get the different ways that lead is measured, or specifically different frequencies. And one thing that I want to point out here is that we do also see some monitoring that is not enforceable. So, you know, this ALR code is going to tell us, okay, you know, there's 500 or so permits around the country where they've got to monitor for lead, but they're not on the hook for it. You know, there's nothing enforceable behind any of the levels. All right, so then what does this look like in this specific watershed in Adams County that we are focused on? Well, again, total suspended solids, really important. E. coli here as well, benzene. And we know that there's about 7,000 or so permits in that watershed. So the vast majority of them, you know, on the hook for total suspended solids. For lead in particular, we don't have any enforceable permits in that watershed around lead, but we do have some about 40 or so facilities that do have to report on it. So EPA keeps track of facilities reported exceedances. So when facilities make these reports every week or every other week or whatever it is, they automatically look at whether that value reported by the facility is in excess of what the permit is. And so here we're looking at all of the exceedances for fiscal year 2022. And, you know, this is just a summary here of some of the top pollutants in excess. Of course, total suspended solids, not a surprise here that it's the top, because we sorted this just by the number of exceedances, and we know it's the most frequently permitted one, so maybe not surprising it's the most exceeded. But the median percentage at which the values are reported above the permitted threshold are quite a lot, 60% over. And we see that, you know, pretty high numbers for all of these other substances as well. In our specific watershed, you know, we get into some specific, you know, substances here as well. And, you know, if you exceed your permit at a certain, you know, for a certain number of times over a certain time period, you do run the risk of getting a water quality violation. And in fact, yeah, exceeding your permit will get you a water quality violation, right? An effluent violation in particular. So here we look, you know, across the country, what are those effluent violations looking like? And the way we measure that, I can get into this in more detail later, but the way we look at this is as a frequency or a rate So, we've looked at the top 10 watersheds in years here, where in 2020, this watershed, there was one facility that accumulated 580 violations somehow, um, which means, you have a pretty high violation rate. Now, we're only able to look at that rate in terms of a sort of intensity. So, it's not out of all regulated facilities, it's out of those that have violations. So there might be 100 facilities in this watershed, but the way we're doing this calculation is out of the one that had the violations, how many violations did they have? And that gives us that rate. And the reason for that is historically, EPA doesn't keep track of how many facilities are regulated. Like, we don't know how many facilities were regulated in 2007. Or it's not easy to access that information. So we can't do it out of the whole. But, for the selected watershed that we're looking at, we can look at this over time to get that sort of bad actor feel. Where, we have in 2005, 250 or so violations per 100 facilities in violation. Basically, that means that every facility that is in violation or accumulates an F1 violation accumulates 2.5, right? So they're routinely doing bad things. And that sort of dropped off over time. Whether that's a real thing or changes in reporting, we'd have to investigate further, at least in this watershed, let's say. We look at the top 10 watersheds nationwide. It's kind of hard to see on this map, but they are out west for the most part: Oklahoma, California, Nevada, Washington, Idaho. If we zoom back into our selected watershed and kind of try to get a sense of who is causing these violations, well, here we map out the 100 facilities that have been in non-compliance over the past 13 quarters. So these are facilities that have, been deemed to be non-compliant. They've accumulated a lot of violations over the past 13 quarters. And there might be more than 100. We just look at the top 100. Now, of course, state and federal EPA are going to take different enforcement actions against facilities that are in violation and non-compliant. Whether they do so and to what extent they do so is an interesting question. So if we look at the enforcement rates nationwide, we see, this watershed here, we've got 227 different actions over the past 20 plus years against 9 different facilities. And that's kind of an indication of, how routinely bad some of these actors can be, as well as how diligent perhaps these agencies are. They're lobbying 227 different written orders and penalties and whatever it might be against just 9 different facilities, giving us this high rate. And if we look at where that's happening, we actually find that that's in North Carolina. In fact, nationwide, the top several are in North Carolina. And of course, really what's at the core of all this concern about enforcement and compliance is water quality. What does this mean for the point source pollution effects on water quality? If we know that facilities are routinely out of compliance with their permits, if we know that there's a lot of permits to legally allow so much pollutants into the water as well, what does that mean for water quality? So looking at our specific watershed and drawing on the EPA's ATTAINS database of water degradation and watersheds, looking specifically at the ones that have been assessed, we get the following picture. So the darker the shade of purple here, the more degraded a sub-watershed in the overall big one in Adams County has been determined to be. Now, there's a lot of gaps here because those sub-watersheds haven't been assessed. If we look at the ones that have been assessed, we can see some hot spots of degradation. Now, linking that to specific point sources, well, we'd have to go back and look at those bad actors and look at potential non-point sources and whatever, but this starts to give us a clue of perhaps where that degradation is happening. So this analysis is focused on nationwide trends in enforcement and compliance with environmental protection laws over time. So to what extent are state and federal EPA agencies enforcing things like the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which manages toxic or hazardous waste? And to what extent are facilities regulated under those acts complying? So we're going to be looking at things like violations of those laws, inspections done of facilities under those laws, and enforcement actions levied against violators of those laws. So the first cell of this notebook essentially just brings in extra code to help us perform the rest of the analysis. And I've already run it for the purposes of this demo, but I'll run it again just to give you a sense of what it looks like to interact with a notebook. I'm simply pressing play, and it's doing the work of retrieving all that extra software for me. Now, in this notebook, we are loading data that has already been sort of pre-processed from another notebook, which I will show here for you. So we're loading in statistics from the past 5 years or so on the enforcement and compliance with environmental protection laws. Now, we developed these statistics, which you see here, through a comprehensive analysis of our database, our copy of the enforcement and compliance history online database in this notebook. So you can see this notebook is a little bit longer. There's longer cells of code. But what we're doing here is we're retrieving basically spreadsheets that tell us, okay, in this case, this is every regulated facility in EPA's database. We're summarizing how many facilities are currently or at that time, this is 2023, regulated under the Clean Air, Clean Water Act, RCRA, as well as reporting greenhouse gas emissions. We're looking at Clean Air Act inspections. So each row here is an inspection done in 2023 under the Clean Air Act or reported under the Clean Air Act. And we're calculating rates. So how many inspections? Okay, we have 37,000 here. Well, what does that mean out of every 1,000 facilities? So some basic math there. So that number is simply loaded in here. And then we analyze it in this cell. So by running this cell code, which I did with a keyboard command, Shift Enter, okay. But we can select the program. Okay. We'll start with the Clean Air Act and select the indicator that we want to look at. So one of the most important things that we think is the case when it comes to enforcement and compliance is understanding what Claire Ewing has called the violations pipeline. So we might be interested in understanding, well, who are the bad actors when it comes to, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, whatever it might be. Well, one way to look at that is to look at violations of those laws, reported violations. The problem is that in many cases for certain programs, we only find violations when we do inspections. So we have to understand, well, how many inspections done by state, or in some cases federal EPA, how many inspections are being done? So we're going to look at these together. So we select both of these. And in this cell, then we printed a nice chart that shows us more about the data. So you can see here in the green bar, we have Clean Air Act inspections per 1,000 regulated or active facilities. So in other words, about 1 in 4 regulated facilities in 2019 received an inspection. That number has dropped over time. And if we went back further, although for various reasons we can't necessarily calculate that rate previously, but if we went back further, I think we would see that number, well, we would see it decline over even a longer period. Now, some of the 2023 numbers might be due to maybe not all the inspections have been filtered into the database yet, so we do have to keep that in mind. But generally, we do see somewhat of a drop-off. Some of it might be due to the pandemic as well, starting in 2020. And of course, not every inspection will find a violation. So we see here, okay, maybe about 20 violations per 1,000 facilities. But the point is that if we're not doing as many inspections, we may be less likely to find violations. Now, that is less true for the Clean Water Act. Let's take a look at that. So we go back up here, select the Clean Water Act, and then look at inspections and violations again. And so what we see here is actually quite essentially a sort of reverse trend, at least in terms of inspections versus violations. So we see fewer inspections, less than 200 per 1,000 facilities, a number that has also somewhat declined over time, or the past 5 years. But then we also see quite a high rate of violations. So basically over 1,000 violations per 1,000 facilities. And this is due to how reporting occurs in the Clean Water Act, where facilities are making electronically submitting discharge monitoring reports to state and federal EPA that then get basically checked against permit levels to see whether the facility has reported discharging above the permitted level. And so that can automatically flag violations, leading to higher rates. So you don't necessarily need the inspections as much, and we don't see them as happening as much. It's also worth looking at enforcement actions and penalties here. So we'll take a quick look at enforcement actions and see what that looks like. So we see, just given the high number of violations in the Clean Water Act that are in many cases being generated automatically, a very low rate of enforcement actions like penalties and written orders and whatever per violation. So 0.01 there. That differs if we were to look at the Clean Water Act, where we see actually, not quite one action per violation, but a lot closer. In other words, not every violation is going to get an enforcement action, but we're a lot closer in the Clean Water Act. Penalties per facility in violation. I'm not going to show this. I encourage you to explore it on your own time, but it is sensitive to, large settlements made with egregiously violating facilities in different years. So it's really hard to look at trends in that. And if we can see that if we look at the max penalty here, where in 2023, there must have been some sort of settlement with a group of companies that led to a huge fine under the Clean Air Act. Finally, although there are no legal limits federally to greenhouse gas emissions for facilities, many of them are required to report greenhouse gases to the EPA. And we can look at some of that information as well. So if we look at emissions here, this is going to be total over the years for those facilities required to report. And we do see a general decline in some years, perhaps due to the pandemic, steeper than others. And we also see, if I'm not mistaken, the largest emitters actually increasing. So although in aggregate emissions are coming down, the worst of the worst are maybe getting worse. So this is a very short notebook compared to some of what we've produced in the past, but this gives us a sense of not just facility by facility, what challenges and enforcement of and compliance with environmental protection laws might look like, but what this looks like overall across the nation. So I've already pre-run part of this notebook. And so I won't necessarily press play on all these cells, but this first one here actually just loads in some data that we'll use in the rest of the notebook. So if I run this, it'll take a second, and then it'll print done. And I can see the code here if I go ahead and do that, but it's not necessary. So here, we're just giving you a sense of what this analysis can start to look like, or what sort of data that we're looking at for. So we've pre-calculated some metrics that we store in a database for each congressional district in the country. So each dot here represents one of those congressional districts, and the metrics here relate to Clean Air Act inspections in that district out of all 1,000 out of 1,000 regulated facilities. How many inspections do we see? And the same here with violations. So for instance, this dot out here, this district, we see nearly 3,000 inspections over the past 5 years per 1,000 facilities. So a lot of inspections being done, and maybe 750 violations per 1,000 facilities over the past 5 years. So, a lot of inspections being done, a lot of violations being found. This really gives us a kind of sense of how inspections are turning into violations or not. Now, this is fairly limited, right? Because we don't, just in this chart, we can't see which districts they are. We don't know any of their spatial dimensions. So we're going to actually map this out. In here, we go and get some of that information. This is just congressional districts and the 118th Congressional, 118th Congress mapped out here. And now we're going to look at what each metric looks like mapped out across the country. So by default, we are looking at the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. And here we're looking at the percent of facilities in violation, or actually the percentile that district scores in terms of violations of RCRA over the past 5 years. So what that means basically is how many congressional districts is a specific district doing worse at when it comes to violations. Maybe it'll be clear if we look at a specific example here. So if we zoom in, the darker shades of red here are higher values. So if we look at basically any district in Kentucky, we see scores somewhere between 0.8 and 1, which means that these districts are ranked higher or worse when it comes to violations of RCRA over the past 5 years than 80% of all other districts in the country. And we see how this trend plays out across the country. Washington, Utah, Missouri, Arkansas, Kentucky, New Hampshire, these states tend to be ranked higher when it comes to relative to other districts in the country. So that's just one of the metrics that we're mapping out here. We wanted to look at Clean Water Act inspections per 1,000 facilities. Well, the average for the US is about 100 out of 1,000 facilities. So basically, over 5 years, we're only the US and state EPA agencies are only looking at 10% of all facilities in most districts. And we see that here. We see some states, it does tend to fall along state lines because environmental protection laws are implemented at a state level and data about them are reported at the state level. So we see like Iowa, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Oklahoma are reporting more Clean Water Act inspections per 1,000 facilities than other states. Let's see what's Clean Air Act inspections. We'll look at that since we saw it up here as well. So we actually map this out. We see certain states and parts of states reporting higher inspection rates. So Central Valley in California seems to be some of the highest inspection rates in the country. Other states in the south and east reporting high rates. But if we look at violations, we see, not particularly high rates anywhere, real sort of outliers here in the Central Valley where we are seeing more inspections. So that's the past 5 years. But if we want to look at the longer term to analyze whether we see any patterns in political administration, we can look back to 2001, which was when the US EPA says this data is probably as reliable as it gets. And just to keep in mind here, again, environmental protection laws are implemented at the state level. The data we're seeing here are states reporting it to the US EPA where we grab it. So states are really the ones on the hook here for this information. And, of course, some states are going to be maybe dragging their feet in submitting that data, or it might have more errors than other states. All important things to keep in mind. So if we look at nationwide trends since 2001, we're looking here at RCRA. We see generally a decrease in inspections reported overall since basically the Obama administration, especially drop-offs in 2020 with the pandemic. Maybe sort of resurgence in the Biden administration, perhaps. But that might just be recovering from the pandemic drop-off in 2020. Violations follow inspections, generally, under most programs, because you inspect a facility, you find out whether there's a violation. That'll be different with the Clean Water Act, which we'll look at in a second. Enforcement actions also just dropping since the Obama administration. So really, we might be, if we're not finding as many violations, EPA is probably not taking enforcement actions. Penalties tend to be variable just based on the willingness of the administration, I suppose. Let's take a look at the Clean Water Act, which is a little bit different and perhaps includes more reliable data because it involves automatic reporting of certain pieces of information directly to the US EPA. So we see a lot more inspections being reported under the Clean Water Act since 2016 or so. A rise in the number of violations reported, in part because monitoring data is being directly reported to the EPA and violations can be automatically flagged. Enforcement actions are up since the Biden administration. Penalties, you have kind of outlier years here actually in 2012. So what does that look like spatially? These are national trends over time. Let's map out these using different metrics. This first one that we're looking at is actually RCRA violations and where we have places that recently were under the long-term average. So basically places where we're seeing fewer RCRA violations last year, 2023, than we saw, on average over the past 20 plus years. So that's places like Kansas, Vermont, certain parts of, Iowa, Midwest, different parts of states here. Where do we see fewer RCRA inspections? recently compared to the long-term average. It varies, but you know, southern New Jersey is a standout here, as well as Western Kentucky. We look at Clean Water Act inspections, where we're seeing fewer inspections than that long-term average. Illinois really stands out here. We can also look at sort of, if we look at violations, we can look at above long-term averages. So we're seeing more violations of the Clean Water Act in these places compared to the long-term average. Now we saw in the trend above, in general, more violations recently compared to the past 20 years. These are the places that are really seeing more Clean Water Act violations, especially southern West Virginia, those being reported more. Southern Illinois, despite fewer inspections.